quite shocking for Palestinians, even though they had experienced settler violence in smaller degrees. And it set off, wasn't much later, April, that you had the first suicide belt bus bombing. And it started, and that's when that started. And it was Hamas who explicitly said, this is in retaliation for Baruch Goldstein. And these went on. Yahya Ayash was one of the main, he's called the engineer. He was one of the main Palestinians who built the bombs and who did it. And he was assassinated in 1996 by the Israeli army. And that set off a whole sort of another round. And in those years, you had about 3 or 4 bombings, bus bombings in Israel a year, right? About 3, every like third month, 3 or 4 months, there would be a bombing in those years. So this is the late 90s. Late 90s. Increasing settlement, increasing violence, bus bombings that had not really been going on before that at all. They started in 1994. And frustrating closures and checkpoints. And in 2000, while the PLO and the Israeli government are still trying to negotiate an end, Ariel Sharon, thinking about the upcoming elections, wanting to make the prime minister at the time, Ehud Barak, look bad and make himself look tough, marched around on one of the holiest places of Islam, Haram Sharif, or Dome of the Rock, in Jerusalem, with like 1,000 police and soldiers on a Thursday night, Rosh Hashanah, and the next day, Friday, kids came out protesting to the checkpoints, throwing stones. Not an unusual event. My interpretation, well, not an interpretation, the Israeli army opened up and killed about 40 people in the first 2 days, which was really unusual because they had been using like rubber bullets and plastic bullets and tear gas, and their lethality, the numbers were like 1 or 2 killed, 30 injured, right? That was what you heard in those days. But like there were like a dozen Israeli Arabs, Israeli Palestinian killed at protests of this in Israel. That was unheard of. And then there were like 40 killed in the occupied territories. And that was high. And the spiral of what became the new Al-Aqsa Intifada began. And, okay, so Israelis, I have here Israeli point of view on the violence. Israelis, this is their images. They started to suffer, not just, it was 3 or 4 bombings a year. Now it was like 3 or 4 bombings a month with the new Intifada, right? Bombings in Sparrow's Pizza in Jerusalem. And there was one event where 2 soldiers, early on, in the first few days, 2 soldiers were caught in Ramallah. And the Israeli press reported that they were lost. I cannot believe that for a second, because there were large stones in front of Ramallah, and you couldn't drive in there without big signs in Hebrew that said, "Do not go past this point." It was like it's unlikely that they were lost and found themselves in Ramallah. Maybe they were there on a military mission. Maybe they were there doing some business mission with some Palestinians they knew. Nobody knows. They were grabbed, pulled out of the car. The police put them in a police station to try to protect them. A crowd went in, pulled them out, murdered them, threw them out the window. It was caught on photographs, and the Israelis saw that and said, we got to do this war, right? That's what to the Israelis. That's what characterized the Palestinians, and the bombings and this event here had a huge impact. For also, in later time, as the security got stepped up and prevented suicide bombing, mortars and rockets became the next vehicle, much less effective, right, militarily speaking, but still scary, right, for Israelis. And we see this rise in the late 2000s of these events, especially as it became way more difficult to scare Israelis with suicide bombs because of security. Now, for Palestinians, the images were of kids confronting the army and getting killed by the army, right? This kid became a famous photograph, right? And every photographer who goes into the occupied territories wants to get another kid in that pose. So it's become like a cliche, but it's a tragic cliche. I've got 2 kids now, and most of my friends have kids who are teenagers, and they get pulled into this, and that kid's dead right now. The kid who's in that photograph. And one of the things that most shaped Palestinians, if you pick one media event like I did for the Israelis, was this one in the middle, Mohammed Dura, right? And a videotape of him getting caught in the crossfire and getting killed while his father is trying to protect him for Palestinians, Mohammed al-Dura became this key symbol, right? This innocent kid getting killed. And so these are the martyrs, the kids at checkpoints getting, unarmed kids getting harassed by soldiers. This is what Palestinians were seeing, not just on TV, they were seeing it in their daily lives, right, in a big way. So for 2000, 2008, I'm not including the recent events in Gaza. This gives you sort of a rough idea of the fatalities that occurred, Israeli fatalities and Palestinian fatalities. It's somewhat imbalanced. But one thing I want to point out is that the civilians make up the largest number on both sides, right? Civilians are the main. Okay, so there's a lot of numbers up there, but 1,044 Israeli fatalities, 490 civilian, and 237 civilian in the occupied territories versus Israel, and about 335 soldiers killed, and Palestinian fatalities, 2,574. Most of them, of course, are in the occupied territories, are civilians, and 1,725 are identified as combatants, and then a whole lot of people, which basically means they're adult males that were killed, that they can't clearly identify as combatants, and they can't clearly identify as non-combatants, so they're in this sort of middle zone here. Yeah. Okay. And then a much smaller number of people killed in Israel. Some of those are more individualized attacks. Okay. Now, it's not just, I have back here, let me show this one picture. I didn't mention this. This has had a devastating effect on the, infrastructure in the West Bank, these attacks. I'll just point to this little hole. See that hole in the wall there? This is shot up by bullet holes. You can't really tell that. But this is a new kind of urban warfare. It used to be they'd go into a village or into a town, the Israeli army, and they'd go through the streets and they'd encounter gunfire. So in order to lower their casualties, their new technique of urban warfare, I imagine it's been exported to other conflicts, is to go inside the building with what I'd call a stud finder, right? Which I use to put on a wall and it beeps so you know where to put your nail to hang a picture. Okay, they use it the opposite way. They go into the Palestinian homes, they find where the studs are, the supports, and then they blow a hole where there is no support into the next building. So they move through neighborhoods by blowing these holes through them. They enter them and move through neighborhoods instead of moving through the street. So this is like devastating, right, for a civilian population. And if you move, certainly in refugee camps, Tulkarem and Jenin, in the refugee camps around Ramallah, Jalazon, that's where this stuff is really bad and really evident. Okay. There's also structural violence. Okay, structural violence is 7:30. So let's see. Well, I can't do 10 minutes, but 15. All right, I'll move around. Structural violence is violence. Okay, you know what armed violence is. That's what we've been talking about. With armament or arms, right? Hitting somebody, that's armed violence. Acute, painful violence. Structural violence is when people suffer, bodily suffering, through policy. Not necessarily through a gun, but a policy like checkpoints, right? Or through policies that, in this case, destroy homes, right? Because they don't have permits, right? That causes a certain kind of suffering for people that's in addition to the military conflict. Cutting down trees, agricultural destruction. We've had 1.3 million agricultural trees destroyed in the occupied territories since this intifada began. Olive trees are a key source of the Palestinian economy. So that's been devastating. Over 1 million chickens. I didn't put that up here, but the list goes on. There's a extensive structural violence it has happened. Checkpoints, another kind of structural violence. They're all over the territories now. This prevents people from going to work. It prevents people from getting to health care. students from getting to the university or to their schools if they're going to schools in another town. It basically shuts down life. So you see these pictures of these long lines of cars and young men being pulled out and told, either